Good afternoon and welcome to the first of 4 sessions as part of the What Works Festival of Learning. Over the next 2 weeks we're going to explore new learnings, future challenges in the areas of prevention and early intervention. Questions are going to range from what can the government do to support prevention and early intervention to if prevention really is better than the cure, well then when can we do more of it? How can we adapt an entrepreneurial mindset when it comes to approaches to some of the big future challenges that will confront our public services? And at the time when there is an increasing interest in artificial intelligence, what does that mean for the well-being of future children and young people today in Ireland? We're going to hear from Minister Roderick O'Gorman shortly, and we'll hear from experts from the United States, from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, and of course from TUSLA. We hope this is going to be a defining hour in your week, a time when you can take some deserved time out to step up into the balcony of your brain and just breathe for the next hour, that you'll be able to feel a sense of having reached base camp today, to think about the summits that lie ahead. And we hope that after the hour here with us, that you're going to leave with some practical advice and ideas, but also that we might have put some energy back in your tank. Now, we ask and encourage you for the next hour. There's over 400 of you have registered for today's event. Please ask us questions, send us comments throughout the next hour. You're going to find a little speech bubble to the right hand side of your screen. If you take a look now, click on that. That's where you can ask questions, leave us with feedback and ideas over the duration of this session. To get us started, we want to do a little poll. So next to that speech bubble that you can see to the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a little poll icon. We'd like you to go and hit on that now. And we're just going to ask a very simple question to get a sense of who is actually joining in. There's 400 of you registered today. Just give us a flavour of where you're at. What is your position in this whole world of early prevention and intervention? So we're asking you, are you somebody who is a champion? Or is this absolutely fundamental to the work that you do day to day? Does that meet the brief and description of who you are joining us today? Or are you a skeptic? You're agnostic. We're going to have to convince you over the next hour of the importance of the themes that we're here to discuss. Are you somebody who's curious? You know a little, you'd like to know more? Are you somebody who is just disillusioned? 7.5, 8 months of COVID has just left you with more questions than answers? Or are you somebody who is a novice, somebody who is here to learn from experts like Dr. Patrick McCarthy from TUSLA, from the department, from the minister, to better understand, well, what has actually been happening in Ireland? What have we done well? What do we need to do more of? Because I think, as we're going to hear from Patrick shortly, he would actually put us on a very, very high grade compared to other countries world over. So I can see our results coming in. Thank you for those of you who have clicked on that poll to give us a sense. It seems that the majority of you joining us today are champions. That is great to see. This is fundamental to your work. So I hope for those of you who are champions, we're going to bring you some new insights and learnings. And as I said earlier, put some energy back in your tank. I see some of you are curious. That's good. You're here to learn. I think that's going to be a big theme for Patrick shortly, about staying curious, learning, constantly evolving, wanting to know more, and evolving the research and the data that's available to you. I see some of you are novices, self-described. You're here to learn. You've come to the right place. That's great. And some of you are skeptics. So that's good. And I'm ranking them there as I see them. None of you so far have said you're disillusioned. So congratulations on that. In these never normal times that we find ourselves in, it is good to see that everybody is coming with a curiosity, willing to learn and consider themselves, in many, many cases, champions. So thank you for everybody participating in that poll. As I mentioned, the icon next to that is your little speech bubble. Please use that now for the remainder of this session. Get your questions in. I'm going to be monitoring them here in front of me to make sure that you, the community, this feels like a conversation that everybody is going to learn and benefit from. Now, the other thing I would encourage you to do, I know I'm giving you lots of instructions, but also just we'd like the world without to be aware of today's session. The hashtag is Festival of Learning. If you hear something interesting today, or take a picture of our speakers, or some insight, statistic, something that you'd like to share with your social community, be it LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Use that hashtag Festival of Learning so we can draw attention to today's great event. Now, without further ado, I'd like us to welcome Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, Roderick O'Gorman, to formally open today's proceedings.
I'd like to welcome you all to this series of webinars on the topic of prevention and early intervention. And I'd like to extend a particular welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Patrick McCarthy, former president of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, who's joining us from the United States. Dr. McCarthy has been a productive and positive influence on this department for years, and he's had an important advisory role in helping to establish the What Works initiative. Prevention and early intervention means anticipating possible problems, minimising risks as they arise, and targeting resources at those at high risk or showing early signs of a problem. There is abundant evidence supporting the cost effectiveness of prevention and early intervention programs to reduce the long-term need for more costly interventions throughout a child and young person's life. More importantly, prevention and early intervention can lead to better health and greater engagement with education. The difficulties which arise in the lives of children and young people can be resolved before they cause harm. It's appropriate that the first topic in this series of webinars is championing prevention and early intervention in government. My department has had a leading role in this area in collaboration with our partners in statutory and non-statutory sectors. Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, the national policy framework, includes strengthening prevention and early intervention as a transformational goal. Furthermore, under this framework, prevention and early intervention were identified as cross-sectoral priorities back in 2015. Since then, a key development has been the What Works initiative. What Works is designed to nurture and to grow and to champion evidence-informed prevention and early intervention approaches. What Works is also intended to recognise and champion the work of those in the non-statutory sector who've been instrumental in delivering prevention and early intervention approaches to children and young people. This includes our previous open-funded opportunities, the What Works Innovation Fund and the What Works Network Support Fund. Part of our What Works initiative is about celebrating, commending and championing the experiences of those who are outside of government. We want to foster a parity of esteem between all those working to improve the lives of children and young people. We also want to recognise that there are many kinds of evidence and many sources of knowledge. While formal evaluations will continue to have an important role in the area of prevention and early intervention, we also want to acknowledge the experience of those directly working with children and young people in many circumstances. It's incumbent on all of us to approach each webinar in this series, and particularly the contributions we're going to hear shortly, with an open mind. I think that all of us have a piece of the puzzle and we can all solve it together, delivering better outcomes for our children and young people. I'm also very pleased to welcome those attending from broader fields who may not have direct experience of working in prevention and early intervention. This series of webinars is designed to be as accessible as possible, conversational and indeed enlightening for us all. We'll explore new ideas and give our contributors, as well as us, the audience, a chance to have a robust discussion of the future of prevention and early intervention in Ireland. It remains for me to thank you all once again for attending today. I look forward to the conclusions of this important series and to a lively and productive discussion as to how we can best promote prevention and early intervention in government. Thanks very much.
Now, sometimes in order to understand where we need to get to next in the future, we need to understand first where we've travelled from, the journeys voyaged on. And so the next video is going to tell the story of the state's role to date in prevention and early intervention.
The story so far, the state's role in prevention and early intervention in Ireland. Prevention and early intervention is all about stopping risks to healthy child development before they take hold, and helping to make sure children live happy and healthy lives. It involves all of us, as parents, family members, in our communities, and in services for children and young people. Throughout our history, the state has played a leading role in prevention and early intervention through government departments and agencies, by enacting legislation and developing policy, designing and funding services, and working in partnership with everyone involved in children's lives. Prevention and early intervention is now recognised in Ireland and around the world as essential for improving children's health, mental health and education. We have come a long way, but we still have to go on our journey to giving children and young people the best start in life. But how did we get to where we are? And how can we continue to improve? To plan for the future, we must look at the past. As we look back, we can see 3 different eras of prevention and early intervention in Ireland. Era 1. Partnership and inclusion. It all started with a growing awareness of the rights of children. Up until the 1970s, family took centre stage in Irish life and women didn't work much outside of the home. Then in the 70s, things began to change, the rights of women and children becoming more important. In the 1980s, the community and voluntary sector grew and expanded its reach, and with support from the state, brought about innovation in services. Family support services emerged which aimed to relieve pressure on families. Many of these involved local people and thinking about how local needs might be addressed. The 1990s saw increased investment from philanthropy in partnership with the state to support new approaches to designing, delivering and evaluating services. Local partnerships were established, which created the infrastructure to reform and deliver services for children and families. New legislation was enacted, such as the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This paved the way for the Office of the Ombudsman for Children to be created in 2003. For years, children were to be seen and not heard. In 2000, for the first time, the National Children's Strategy consulted with nearly 2,500 children and young people. In 2005, the Office of the Minister for Children was established, and in 2011, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs was set up. There was growing interest and investment in research, and the words evidence-based policies started to be heard more and more. Era 2, Spirit and Science. In this period, the partnership between the state and philanthropy brought about increased investment in evidence-based programs for children and families in Ireland. Some used prevention and early intervention programs and sophisticated evaluation methods for the first time. These ideas were rooted in science, but in the Irish context, it was also about the spirit of local communities. Services around the country used the science and adapted it for their communities. Their experience and learning helped to shape and inform policy and services for children and families for the next 15 years. In 2014, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs published Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, the first overarching national policy framework for children and young people towards which all government departments and agencies, statutory services and the voluntary and community sectors would work. At the same time, TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, was set up. Since it was founded, the agency has used strong prevention and early intervention approaches in its work to support parents and their children. Era 3, Sharing Knowledge, Transforming Lives. The world is constantly changing and evolving, and the speed of technological development provides opportunities to enhance government policy and services. Recent initiatives by the Department of Children, such as What Works and First 5, are providing leadership and coordination and showing what works in prevention. We have come a long way, but there is still much to learn. So let's embrace a spirit of curiosity when looking to the future of children's policy and services. It's all about continuing to share, question, and use all the evidence we have to provide better services and to improve children and young people's lives today so that they may have brighter tomorrows.
Now, joining us all the way from the United States, where there is absolutely nothing else happening there today, is Dr. Patrick McCarthy. Patrick is an internationally recognised leader in juvenile justice and child welfare reform, and he's the immediate past president and chief executive officer of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Patrick also currently serves as the Stoneleigh Visiting Fellow in partnership with the Columbia University Justice Lab. And as the Minister mentioned earlier in his welcoming remarks, Patrick has been an important advisor in helping establish the What Works initiative. The theme, as we know today, is what can the government do to support prevention and early intervention? And as we tackle this question now at Patrick, I encourage you, for those of you maybe only joining now, head down to that little speech bubble at the right-hand corner and start asking us some questions and send us feedback as we go through it. Patrick, that's a big question, but let's maybe start with the basics, the fundamentals to the scaffolding we need to broach these big themes.
Well, thanks so much, Anya. It's such an honor to be here and to be watching what's happening in Ireland over the last many years. That was a terrific summary that we just heard. I guess I should start by saying that I think the scaffolding is largely in place. The question is, how do you now strengthen the scaffolding to take on more than what you've already done? As the minister suggested earlier, I'm a strong believer that Ireland is leading the world in many ways, unlike other countries I can even think of, in showing what can be done with a focus on early prevention and intervention. Just a quick note, it's really important to recognize that adding prevention and early intervention programs is critical, but you have to start with the basics of what children need. They need economic security. They need economic opportunity, health care, early childhood supports for their family. They need very high quality education. So all those basics really need to be in place, because programs alone will not help a family and a child deal with deep poverty. So that's just perhaps an obvious thing, but I wanted to start with that. I think there's a lot that Ireland is already doing and perhaps could do more in that basic infrastructure area. So for example, one of the things that government and partners with government need to do is come to consensus on the targets. What are you trying to achieve? A regular revisiting of those targets is really important. So what are the bottom line results that you hope to see? What kinds of children's outcomes do you expect to improve? Related to that, again, with partners, government has a big role in collecting and analyzing and sharing the data that lets folks know how are we doing against those targets, and how do we understand the story behind that data. So not just quantitative data, as important as that is, and not just analyzing quantitative data, but really getting out to the community, talking to people, having conversations about what do the data mean in different communities. It's not necessarily the same from one community to the next. The other piece that you already are well on the way, but I think there perhaps could be more done, is to make sure there's a clearinghouse where the best practices from around the world, which is what you've already done, but the best practices, the best programs, the best insights into what children need are, again, broadly available. That includes having things available on the web, but it also means, again, getting out into community, having conversations with families and with providers within those communities, so that information is being widely shared. The clearinghouse that you have so far really emphasizes those programs that have a lot of evidence behind them, and that's a critical piece. At the same time, there's another step, which again I think is mentioned in some of your planning, which is to continue to develop additional interventions that have promise, especially those that may be quite effective, but they're currently either at too small a scale or they're targeted to a community that is relatively small. Building evidence so they can be added to the clearinghouse, I think, is important. There's a way in which we think about programs as kind of black boxes, like we have the whole program, but when you start to unlock that box, you start to see they're really cross-cutting across many different programs, effective practices, and really identifying those practices and then developing additional programmatic resources based on those practices is really important. For example, the ability to engage families, to have families as partners rather than just recipients. Now, there are some other kind of broader issues that I could touch on if we had time around infrastructure and funding and some of the learning pieces. But I think I'll stop there, Anya, and give you a chance to ask another question.
No, that's so helpful. And you mentioned there within the scaffolding the importance of that clearinghouse. But I'm struck, how do you get the balance between those evidence-based approaches and looking and understanding the data, but yet leaving enough flexibility sometimes to do things that just feel right, that are specific to a culture, a community? Is that balance something you think a lot about?
Yeah, it's a struggle, I think, because there's a tendency for almost a conflict that can come out. Now, again, in the context of the U.S., different racial and ethnic groups may have different preferences for approaches, and there's a sense that, the white dominant culture has kind of captured evidence-based practices, and our African American communities, our Latinx communities, other communities say, well, no, that doesn't fit with us. That's not how we think about family. That's not how we think about what helping is all about. And so there really has to be space made to both keep the focus on, is something effective, like how do we decide that, but also to recognize that something that may have been tested with one group of folks may not be effective with another group of folks, or may need major adaptation. And there are some evidence-based programs that have done better jobs of that than others, quite frankly. They have really worked to do those kinds of cultural adaptations. Let me give you just a quick example. There are an increasing number of efforts to implement what's called restorative justice for young people here in the U.S. There's not been randomized controlled trials of restorative justice. But when you talk to folks in the community, when you talk to the young people involved, when you talk to folks who have been victimized by crime, they're very enthusiastic about this intervention. So we need to start doing some of that evidence gathering to move it from very promising, and there's a lot of support for it, into something that's considered to be evidence-based and therefore eligible for funding that it wouldn't otherwise be eligible for. My last point on that particular topic, I think, is that conflict, that tension can be healthy and useful, but we sometimes forget that it isn't evidence-based programs versus promising programs. It's evidence-based programs and promising programs as compared to things we're doing that we know don't work or may do harm. And again, in the U.S., for example, incarceration, we have lots of evidence that it does harm, and a lot of money is going into that intervention. Let's free up that money and invest it in both promising interventions and things that already have established evidence.
And obviously the critical piece then in all of that, if we're going to do the basics, get the scaffolding right, have these cultural adaptations, have the research projects, make smart bets and investments, and as you say, stop doing the things then that maybe don't work, reinvest your monies elsewhere. What are you seeing maybe in the United States when it comes to funding that is new, that is innovative, that is actually going to ensure that there is sustainability to a lot of these projects?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's a lot of experimentation going on. Some of it is tying funding explicitly to evidence-based practices. So an increasing number of states, and there's some work on the federal level as well, are saying that there's a category of funding that only those programs that are either in the categories they use as well supported, meaning multiple randomized controlled trials, supported, meaning very strong quasi-experimental evidence, or promising, that is some evidence that it's effective. And if you don't meet one of those criteria, then you're not eligible for that funding. So that's kind of where the direction has been moving on evidence-based funding. However, some other interesting things are happening. For example, providing or encouraging community providers to come together as a network, and then having an organization that oversees that network to enable them to more successfully compete for funding. So a small organization finds it very hard to compete for funding from the public sector. But if a number of small organizations come together and they pool their resources so they have a stronger infrastructure, they're better able to apply for that funding. So that's another example. A third is what in this country we call mini grants. That is making a pot of money available so that a group of residents who might have an idea about a recreational program or a school support program or tutoring program, mentoring program, can apply for relatively small grants with very little fuss about all the hoops they have to jump through in order to get those dollars. And it may be $5,000 or $20,000, but in a small community, in a small program, that can make a huge kind of difference. So that kind of flexibility. The funding for results, that is having performance-based funding contracts so that you are expected to achieve certain results in order to get that funding. And there are many other kinds of examples of that kind of funding. But the critical piece is the flexibility, to recognize you've got to figure out a way to move money into community and not just have the larger providers, more well-established providers, kind of take all those resources and leaving nothing for the smaller, more nascent kind of providers.
It's really great to hear there is an opportunity, for organisations that might at times be competitive are finding ways to be collaborative, build consortia, as you say, that they can play to each other's strengths. So it's really great to see that as a theme emerging alongside the mini-grants. I wonder, are you seeing similar innovations in this moment then when it comes back to the data and research question, the assessments, learning activities, a different way of doing maybe focus groups and the likes? Is there anything there that you've seen as a core takeaway that we should be thinking about here in Ireland?
Yeah, there are a couple different things. One is the importance of structured but nevertheless qualitative research. That is, focus groups can be very, very helpful, but they have their limits, like who comes to a focus group, how are people compensated, et cetera. So it helps to kind of get some meat on the bones of what the quantitative data are telling us. But you really need to get out into the community. So, for example, you can have a series of house meetings where you ask a resident to invite neighbors, and there's just a conversation with public officials or providers or whomever to really dive deep into what folks in that particular neighborhood want. Another more sophisticated approach is to do a random sample of residents of a particular community and bring them together, pay them for their weekend, so you're paying them for their work here. Might be 100 folks that you pull in from the community. Now remember, you've selected them randomly. You present them with a series of presentations about choices that are in front of the government, for example, or in front of the provider, so they become informed about what those choices mean. You have a series of focus groups, again, among those 100 folks, and then at the end, then you do a polling. Say, what do people prefer? And what's been found when you do that is two things. One is natural community leaders actually start to arise that you never would have known about. But you see in a group of 100, you'll see 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 folks. You recognize, oh, they're real potential community leaders. Let's continue to work with them. But you also get a much fuller sense of what a community wants than if you just rely on an organized group that might have a particular interest that they're trying to pursue, but they don't necessarily represent the entire community. So that's kind of another kind of experimental approach that's been going on more and more. It's really important, of course, to recognize that most communities already have an established infrastructure of organizations that do a good job of representing what community wants. And too often there's kind of a gap between those organizations and the public sector. So figuring out how you make that connection, not just for a one-time, but an ongoing connection, again, is an important part of getting true community input.
That's great. Thank you for those opening remarks. We're going to hear an awful lot more from Patrick throughout this session. Keep your questions coming through that speech bubble down to the right-hand side so that we can integrate them towards the end of this. Patrick, I'm going to pull in our other two panellists now. Conor, coming to you first. Conor Riley, you're the Assistant General Secretary at the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. We saw the video earlier. We heard from the Minister. Patrick speaks very, very positively of Ireland's contribution, how we are positioned compared to the rest of the world. For you, what have been some of the milestones? What have been the things we've done well? Maybe what have been the things that we haven't done so well?
Okay, really interesting questions posed, and also Patrick's presentation was very salutary. I think it chimes with a lot of the work we've done in the country thus far, but there's a lot of learning we need to get from still to do. But in terms of our approach to prevention and early intervention, I'm going to speak on behalf of the work of our department specifically, which has a cross-government function as well. And I think it's fair to say that in the past, prevention and early intervention was high in attitude but low in analysis. This has definitely changed. Significant amount of research, data, evidence has supported the work. So we're in a very good place in terms of supporting an evidence base for prevention and early intervention work. We need to accept that we've not got everything right, but there has been an iterative process where we've learned from our mistakes in terms of implementation, and we've learned from successes as well. Are we there yet? I'm not too sure. Do we know where there is? I'm not too sure either. But one thing I suppose I would like to say is that it's possibly not a world of prevention and early intervention. It is a world where prevention and early intervention is situated appropriately on the broad continuum of integrated services in terms of design, delivery and outcomes for children and young people. So it's not a prevention early intervention versus more interventionist approach. And I think it's important that we take that wide angle view as we go on. In terms of our work over the past decade, it's important to say that I'll talk specifically about explicit prevention early intervention programs. But it's also important to say that prevention early intervention is implicit in so much work of government departments, of civil society, across a range of practice fields, and that's important that we build upon that. The challenges we faced in terms of prevention and early intervention was that there was co-funding from state and philanthropy of close to $250 million investment in children's services. So what would we do on foot of this learning, this investment, when we knew the funding was not going to continue, and there were expectations that it would be mainstreamed by a lot of people. So how did we move from this? First of all, we decided to move from a site-specific approach to a systems approach. And by that I mean taking the learning from the investments and trying to inform the system so that the system is stronger and more robust to respond to children and young people. And by the system, I don't just mean statutory, I mean statutory, community and voluntary, because they're all essential parts of that system. And of course, we try to go about securing a return on investment, but crucially on impact. A number of ways we went about this in the context of, and you would have seen it in the video, institutional contexts such as the establishment of TUSLA, the establishment of our own department, and then the seminal document for children and young people, which was Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures. Essentially what we did was we cultivated and built on this infrastructure. We ensured that the profile of prevention and early intervention was given pole position, and we identified it as a cross-sectoral priority in our cross-government work. Going on from there, we hosted an EU peer review, which we felt was really important. Very often when we're dealing with prevention and early intervention in this country, the tradition was to look to the US. Indeed, that's where a lot of the programmatic responses were imported from. We felt it was critical to involve member states, the European Commission, and we looked at the different prevention and early intervention approaches that states have and how these address outcomes for children and young people and address child poverty. So critically, what is the function of prevention and early intervention? It has to have an end outcome, and the end being to improve outcomes and address child poverty. On foot of that, we developed the What Works program, which today is based upon, and really that was critical in terms of trying to get that systems response. We cultivated the infrastructure we had, and in the What Works program, we tried to identify the key deficits that were in place from all the studies and evaluations we had on prevention and early intervention. Critically, the deficit in data, the deficit in evidence, the deficit in learning and development, and also the deficit in quality systems in terms of the infrastructure. So we addressed these key deficits, but also we addressed the efforts. And in the What Works approach, we don't take a stratified view. We've actually tried to make a lateral continuum of all the system that's involved in prevention and early intervention. So that includes a continuum of policymakers, providers, practitioners and community people with a focus on citizen impact. It's important in terms of the observations that we have on this is that prevention and early intervention and more direct intervention should be seen as two sides of the one coin, and critically should be able to show its value as a currency. Important in our approach that we try to light a few fires in different areas rather than try to boil the ocean, because we've seen in the past that very often that doesn't lead to any kind of systems change. So we hope we're getting there gradually and incrementally. We also had to bear in mind degrees of intervention, and really important from the state's point of view that it doesn't take an excessive statist response to intervening, but also critically it's important, and Patrick mentioned it there around community leaders, it's important that we don't professionalise community leaders, that where there's a robust and vibrant volunteer base, that should be cultivated rather than moving in to professionalise it. And there were some observations and learning we had during the process. Also, the critical piece around when we discuss evidence, that we avoid the temptation to over-engineer and excessively prescribe, because this suffocates innovation. It's really important that we have innovation at the forefront, and that has to be kept alive as well. And also to ensure that our investments are strategic, scalable and sustainable. So I think from our experience what we've done is we've set up a lot of additional structures, but I think the time now is to look at how scalable, how economically feasible it is to continue to do this, and is there a position to actually look at how we reimagine, reconfigure or support our existing structures based on the learning from the additional systems and investments that we've had in prevention and early intervention. And I think really the key in terms of our learning and the test case has been COVID. COVID has provided a challenge to how we perceive and present our work, and it really sings to a lot of the principles of the What Works Prevention Early Intervention initiative, is that we now centralise the citizen in this, and we recognise that all roads lead to the front line. And I think irrespective of what practice we're in, the front line in society is really holding things up at the moment. So
I might come back on that question of COVID and just the impact and how that maybe changed and evolved some of that thinking shortly, Conor. But I might just at this point draw in Dr. Aisling Gillen, who is joining us from Donegal. So we're connecting Baltimore, Patrick, Aisling in Donegal and ourselves here in D1 today. Dr. Aisling Gillen is the Regional Service Director West for TUSLA. Aisling, we've heard Patrick talk about, you know, the importance of reflecting on the journey travelled in order to understand strategically, tactically, where to go next. And I wonder in this moment, as you reflect on maybe the status of the legislation, where we need to now get more specific, more prescriptive, how are you feeling about the journeys travelled today, and where do we need more action?
Yes, Anya, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here today. I think just, I suppose I'm provoked in a number of different directions with kind of the conversation that's happened to date, but just to kind of answer your question, or to try to answer it, because it's a complex question, I suppose I go back to my original delight at the Childcare Act 1991, which basically talked about the provision of childcare family support services, talked about the commissioning of the voluntary community service sector, you know, in that regard, and that kind of growth of the voluntary community sector and family support services through that kind of those kind of decades. We welcomed with delight as Conor has alluded to, the setup of the Child and Family Agency in 2014, January 2014, under the Child and Family Agency Act. And people like me who are really into early intervention prevention really believe in it. You know, that concept in the video, stopping risks before they take hold, I think is really kind of fundamentally what it's about. But the Child and Family Agency Act had great words in it. You know, you open it with delight saying, look, supporting, encouraging the effective functioning of families, you know, enhancing preventative family support services to promote the welfare of children, enhancing interagency cooperation, the best interests of the child, really putting the voice of the child at the centre. I think we really welcomed that language in terms of, you know, its content within the Child and Family Agency Act. But I suppose I've just come to the realisation kind of, you know, and I practice in this arena substantially kind of since the startup of TUSLA, and I suppose one of the things that's striking to me is the lack of specificity in the legislation in terms of how those concepts translate into service delivery and into practice. And I think that lack of specificity, a lot of innovation and creativity flows into that space, has been hugely encouraged by the department in this regard under the What Works programme, under the philanthropic kind of support that's been there as well. But particularly the department, I think, who've been hugely supportive of creativity, innovation. But I think that lack of specificity of the layer below those lovely words in the Child and Family Agency Act, for example, leaves a gap in terms of how that translates in terms of expressed priorities for family support, preventative services. And I think that is a gap at the moment. I think the review of the Childcare Act offers some opportunity here just to begin to do that translation, because we do understand a lot more now about family support, preventative practice, and what that means structurally, process, people, partnership and practice-wise. We do have a good sense of that. And I would moot the high-level policy statement on supporting parents and families produced by the department in 2015 under the Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures framework, because that particular document offers really good thinking in terms of specificities of what perhaps need to go into a new iteration of the legislation. And I would just signpost that, really.
That gap is definitely something I'd like to come back to Patrick and Conor on shortly, and that need for prescription and specifics. But can I ask you also, Aisling, just about this time of COVID? Have you found, like, at a time of great difficulty, that's never normal for people, but that maybe there are some positives, be it maybe collaboration or maybe how some of the services are actually operating on the ground?
Well, I think Conor is absolutely right. I think what COVID has done, and Patrick has referred to, as scaffolding around preventative family support. I think in this country we have a great scaffolding around preventative family support in place at the moment. We've great fabric there to build on. Like, we've got our children, young people services committees at county level and sub-county level in some of the Eastern Seaboard. They have been coordinating functions for children and family services that have been stalwarts through the COVID period. Below that, within TUSLA have set up 115 child and family support networks across the country at local areas. And they have been about bringing together all of the partners and statutory voluntary community partners who work with children in a locality, work with children and families, and they come together to share their expertise so that there is no wrong door for children and families. And Patrick has referred to that need to be close to communities, in terms of understanding kind of what communities are saying in terms of what they need in terms of service provision, and the marrying of innovation with, a national platform around provision of services as well. And I think that is really important. Those child and family support networks have incredibly come into their own, as Conor would know, with the Children, Young People Services Committees through the COVID period, because they have had a presence in communities and they've been very close to working with families, delivering food parcels with their social work staff, family support staff on the ground, family resource centres, voluntary community partners. Huge innovation, creativity shown by those networks of statutory voluntary community partners in terms of trying to figure out with families what they needed through the COVID period, and really kind of developing new ways of delivering training, new ways of delivering services, being highly creative, innovative, and actually flowing resources into communities through those mechanisms. So I think there is a balance between what Patrick has talked about, kind of we've administered seed funding grants into the system with support of the What Works programme. One example of innovation, of listening to communities in Mayo, for example, where they worked very closely with the significant high number of travellers living in Mayo. They've engaged with that community proactively, and now we have traveller educators delivering common sense parenting programmes through one of our seed funding programmes. So that balance between innovation, but a kind of specificity in terms of the, setting the framework for that to enable that to happen, I think is critically important. But during the COVID period, it has been all about the front line, as Conor said. and it's been all about how close we can work with children and families. So for example, our prevention is across the continuum of care. So with regard to social work practice, child protection welfare practice, science and safety is the model of practice adopted in Southern Ireland at the moment. And that model of practice, we work on building networks around children and families to keep children safe in communities. And those networks have been absolutely pivotal in the COVID period. We put in about 5.6 million into Creative Community Alternatives, which is our high prevention model of practice. That has wrapped supports in 2019, wrapped supports around more than 500 children on the edge of care to hold them in community, to basically return, get them back into school, get them back into education, into training, hold them in families, but also supporting some of our placements in foster care to hold, to support foster carers to hold children who are experiencing a little bit more trauma and who need additional supports and helps. So that very flexible money is very important as well in terms of programs. In relation to TUSLA, our Early Intervention National Practice Model, which is an evidence-based model, it has been evaluated, is MEHL, which is at the individual level bringing together a team around the child to support the child and family around if they've more than one complex need, what their needs are, working out a plan with them and working towards implementation of the plan. For example, I heard recently of a MEHL, a parent of two children with autism, and the MEHL wrapped around that parent who was struggling with those two children who were on the edge of coming into care, put in behavioural psychology support. That mother now is absolutely doing great, and the kids are doing great, and they're at home with the parent.
That's really great to hear, Aisling. And I'd like to drill into everything everybody's been saying now. And just to encourage everybody tuned in, please go down to the speech bubble there at the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen. You can tap into that to ask our experts some questions, give us feedback. I'll kickstart the first question, but hopefully others I'm going to be watching here are going to come in with questions now. But could we maybe start with that point there by Aisling about the gap? You can have the vision statement, but needing maybe some more specifics, being prescriptive about the strategy, the tactics. Maybe Patrick or Conor, if one of you would like to come in on that first. Patrick?
Sure. So, I guess the question is, at what level do you get more detailed and prescriptive? At the legislative level, I would argue you'd want to be careful about being too prescriptive, because that could lead to some lack of flexibility as you actually do implementation. I might suggest that rather than the word prescriptive, I would focus on results accountable, right? So to me, the question would be, once you get below the broad value statements that are in the legislation and broad structures, et cetera, when you actually start to implement, what are you learning from the results that you're getting on the ground, and are you correcting as a result of the data that you're getting? We haven't talked much about that, but I think that's actually a core piece of the future for Ireland and other places. So the tension between, we know that if you do an evidence-based practice poorly, it won't work, and that leads you towards some prescriptiveness, juxtaposed with lots of folks are different, lots of different community, evidence-based practices don't work for everybody. How do you still have the innovation? I think that meets, like a Venn diagram, it meets in the place of results. Can you improve results by encouraging innovation, as COVID is sort of forcing you to do, while still learning from the things that have been more heavily researched to figure out what are the practices that could be applied to the innovation so that you continually learn and move forward.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for the questions coming in. Keep them coming. I'm going to bunch two questions together under funding, one from William, one from Jill. Maybe Conor, you might go first, but how can we convince funders to fund over 3 to 5 year periods rather than year to year when the programme is showing the results? So much time is spent on applications admin, so that's one question. And just similarly to that question, how do we get rid of the red tape in order to create mini grant funding in Ireland, given that we, the public service, need to be open and also, I think it's accountable. I'm missing a word there, but I think we get the general theme of that. Conor, would you maybe kickstart on that one for me?
Thanks for that, Áine. Just on the first one, that has come up on many occasions, and it's the way the public sector funding model works, that you cannot have multi-annual funding unless it's capital. So there has been a number of different efforts or ideas in terms of trying to change that. It's a difficult one to change, but I think, and we do understand, sectors do need to have a guarantee of what's coming next year to allow them to plan. But similarly, we're all in a similar boat. Public departments operate on the same system as well, an annual budget. The other point on reducing the red tape, I think it's very legitimate. I think in different funding schemes, a lot of different departments, a lot of different agencies are asking the same question in a different way. So surely there could be a way where we could come together at either a local level through the SIPCs or whatever, where funding agencies can be given assurances in terms of one standard application that can be considered, and it's definitely something that I know has a chilling effect in terms of services trying to apply for funding. And also Patrick's point is really relevant. Services that aren't very well resourced are in many cases disadvantaged in terms of they're not on the front foot for applying for these grants. But I do have to say there is a tiered level of funding available through the local youth club grant scheme, through work that Aisling has mentioned, that actually is not too onerous, that gives you seed funding, and I think that responsiveness needs to be kept.
Patrick, great, thank you for that, Conor. I've two questions for you, and by all means build on Conor's answer there as well. One is from Fergal on resilience building. He asks, is Patrick familiar with the work of Wendy Ellis and others at the Centre of Community Resilience at George Washington University? And if so, how does this type of work link conceptually with the type of prevention and early intervention we are discussing today? So that's one for you, Patrick. And the second one, just so I keep going, working in a marginalised, this is from Caroline, working in a marginalised and disadvantaged area as a professional youth worker, this area is hardest hit every time we hit a recession. How do we ensure that these people are protected or proper scaffolding is in place to prevent this happening again going forward?
So it's good with the time left that we have two such easy questions to to try to respond to. In response to the first, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the work at George Washington. I do very much believe that some of the most effective work done not only in prevention and early intervention, but also in intervention is around resilience, building factors that support resilience. But not being familiar with the specific work, I don't know that I could say more than that, other than it's been a key theme in most of the effective interventions that we've seen. I think about motivational interviewing, which folks may be familiar with, which really encourages people to identify the change they want to see and tap into the resilience that they have. Certainly a lot of the trauma-informed work, which is much more widely researched in the U.S., really is based on a model of resilience. The question about how to support families that are particularly hard hit by economic recessions or by other crises, I think goes back to the very first thing that I said, which is that the programmatic approaches are critically important. However, unless you have economic security, economic opportunity, high quality health care, housing, basically the fundamentals that are necessary to lift people out of poverty, programmatic interventions will never be enough. And so, again, each country is different. Each country's system is different. In the U.S., I'm among those who think we still need massive stimulus money, economic stimulus money that is mostly targeted towards those people who are hardest hit. And those are the folks on the bottom end of the economic ladder, families below the poverty line or near the poverty line who have children. We need to make investments, economic investments. Somebody asked me once at a conference, what's the best way to end poverty? And I said, give people money. I mean, that's kind of a flip and glib answer, but the reality is research has shown in the U.S. that $3,000 additional in a year in a family that has children actually has shown improvements in that child's educational attainment, health of the child, and even into a reduced likelihood of becoming involved with the justice system, for example. $3,000 a year, which is, not a small amount of money, but it's not a huge amount of money. So I'm not sure if that answers either question, but that's what got touched off for me.
Great questions, thank you. Keep them coming. Aisling, 2 questions I might group for you, one from Angela, one from Deirdre. Accurate, specific, timely data availability is important in decision making, prioritising, determining how resources are best used and comparing changes over time. Unfortunately, some specific data is only available on a wider scale and not area community specific, making it unusable as an estimate rather than specific. Making data available in smaller areas, community level, would be more beneficial to networks working in areas. Any suggestions as to how we can make this happen within TUSLA and other statutory services and make this data available, please? That was one question, and I'll just add a second one for you, Aisling, which is great to hear the discussion focus on creativity and innovation. How do you ensure that staff are supported to be creative where they can often feel stretched and also where they might be a little bit risk averse?
Yeah. 2 great questions. Under the What Works initiative, for example, Conor would be fully familiar that we've developed the Outcomes for Children Data and Information Hub for CIPSI planning. So basically that plots publishable data for the country across kind of a variety, across the BOB-F indicators basically. That data hub is being built. It is built at the moment. It's publicly available. It plots data to the level that it's publicly available. So some data, you're right, is only available at county level, some is available at sub-county level, at DED level, for example. But it does offer, I suppose, kind of a central repository. I certainly go into it quite regularly when I want to know population figures in one county versus another. I want to know kind of the age profile of kids. It offers a huge kind of data bank of information, and I certainly would signpost people to that. Within TUSLA, we are trying to build our capacity constantly and consistently around using data in terms of informing decision making. So for example, population growth in some of the eastern seaboard areas is being monitored very tightly in terms of service provision need. So, where an estate is built on the edge of Dublin, 80 to 100 new families come in, we're trying to kind of begin to think about looking ahead in terms of using that data for planning purposes. So I think that unfortunately we're caught with kind of what is publishable data, but really the thing about data and what we're working with the Children and Young People Services Committees, Conor would be familiar with this across the country, they look at data on children's lives, but they look at what, the Mark Friedman piece, which is results-based accountability, which you've touched on, Patrick, which is really what is the story behind the statistics? What is this telling us about children's lives? At one point there was a spike in an indicator in southwest Donegal on in relation to increased drug usage in particular communities. There was a lot of kind of coverage in the papers about it at the time. We went to the Chief Superintendent of the Gardaí. Basically what she said was, look, it's a couple of families. We know the ships that are coming in. We know where the drugs are at. It's not as big an issue as what is being portrayed. The story behind the story and the interpretation of local communities, those child and family support networks, taking the data, CIPSIs taking the data and unpicking it and understanding it from their local knowledge around what it is telling us about children and family lives is critical. So it is the analytics of the data is as important as the actual provision of the data itself. So in relation to your second question, building building creativity, the capacity to innovate in organizations. I think the capacity, again, it can be sometimes aided by a little bit of funding. So, for example, we put in small seed funding grants on youth participation, parent participation into every area in the country. Initially, when we put out those small, tiny pots of funding, people said, it's too little. Why are you giving us such little money? Those little bits of money have created massive innovation in local areas. We have over 100 parenting support champions, for example, across the country, who are innovating every day, who are the parent support champions in communities. I think supporting the Prevention Partnership Family Support Programme in TUSLA supports people to be innovative, and managers should encourage, a percentage of innovation and creativity in every worker everywhere in the system, because it is that edging, whilst, we do want kind of layers in terms of prescription, it's the innovation that happens at locality level that builds us for the future forward and keeps that edge in it for families and children.
That's great. Thank you. Those questions have been superb to everyone who sent them in. Patrick, I'm going to ask you to start collecting your thoughts. But Conor, while Patrick is doing that, to leave us on a very hopeful note and give us a call to action in a moment, Conor, just very, very briefly, in under 30 seconds, we hear a lot with the private sector that more innovation has happened in 6 months than it has in 6 years because COVID was actually a forcing function. Is there a positive tale there for the department in terms of COVID as well and some learnings?
Absolutely. What COVID did was it accelerated collaboration and accelerated the achievement of a range of actions. The flexibility, the agility of not just the department, but the sector, the CMV sector, TUSLA as a state agency. More was achieved, I would say, in those number of months and still being achieved than if COVID had not happened. So it was a real call to arms and call to action. And I think what we showed in that was we developed actually an outline and an overview of the range of systems and supports we have for a child and youth and family infrastructure in the country, launched an information and media campaign on that called supportingchildren.gov.ie. And I really thought it showed the range of services there, but crucially the step-up actions and the innovations that collectively we delivered, statutory, voluntary and community.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Patrick, you have the really difficult job now of trying to summarise the last hour to send everybody off, hopefully with some practical final advice, but also maybe just putting energy back in the tank.
Sure, and there's so much I could say, but I'm going to just boil it down to just a few points. Things in front of you that need to be resolved probably are not completely resolvable, but tensions that are important to pay attention to. One is this tension between innovation and prescription. And how do you keep innovation alive and yet at the same time be supporting things where there's evidence that works and being open to things where there's not yet evidence, but it needs to, you need to be focused on it. The COVID conversation actually brings something to the front that I think is really important, which is that any initiative such as you've been at now for many, many years runs the risk of becoming somewhat bureaucratized and stale, and people who are very excited about it sort of drop off. COVID actually presents a horrible, but nevertheless an opportunity to reinvigorate that kind of innovation and that kind of investment in trying things that are different and may actually at least have a little bit of a silver lining of reinvigorating that kind of innovation. The point about the front lines, I think, is absolutely critical. If you're not changing the relationship between the frontline person and who they're working with, you can change everything else and you won't make any difference with the family or the child. So frontline is an important place to continue to invest. We've mentioned intermediaries of different types. I think you've already have some established intermediaries with these councils. I would put more energy into the financing intermediaries as you think about how to push flexible dollars out and deal with some of this innovation versus prescription issue. And finally, this issue of results-based accountability that Iselin raised a moment ago. You know, the question is whether at the national level or at the community level, at whatever level, do you change what you're doing based on the results that you're getting? I mean, that's the core of results-based accountability. So all these other questions ought to flow into that. Do we need to be more innovative because we're not getting the results that we had hoped to get from these established programs? Do we need to invest more in community engagement because we're not getting the results that we'd hoped? So that North Star of results is everything. My last encouragement, if you will, is there's a way in which Ireland is showing the rest of the world what can be accomplished by a cross-sector, committed, long-term, both on the one hand incremental and gradual, but at the other hand bold and visionary focus on children. Please keep showing us the way because we're all counting on you.
Great. Thank you for those wise, inspirational words to Patrick, to Aisling, to Conor. I'm sure you've left a lot of people with a lot of good questions to think hard on in the hours, days and weeks to come. To those of you who asked about today's session, it will be available as a recording in the coming days. Please watch out for that. Just to say as well, this was just the first of 4 sessions. You can sign up for the rest of the sessions coming on Thursday and next week via the whatworks.gov.ie/Festival of Learning website. Our next session, as I mentioned, is this coming Thursday, November 5th, and that takes place between noon and 1 p.m. That's on strengthening prevention in policy. Next week, we're going to return to the themes of innovation and AI, which we touched on very briefly today. Just finally to say thank you for joining us here today, and a thanks also to the What Works initiative, which is designed by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth with funding from Dormant Accounts. The department worked with CES, that's the Centre for Effective Services, in planning and delivering the series of webcasts. Thank you again to Patrick, Aisling and Conor. We'll see you back here on Thursday at noon.
Okay.